One of the most important parts of using support in your speech is to cite your sources, to let your audience know where you got your information from. So first, when we are citing our sources, we have to set up the citation. In other words, we have to explain where we got our information from. And there's a number of different pieces of information that we can give to our audience to let them know where we got our support from. We can let them know the name of the source, the location of the source, the date of the source, and or the identification of the author. So you're going to want to use any combination of these things that gives your audience the most cues to let them know that this source that you're using is credible. So for example, if your source is written by someone who is an expert in the field that your audience is really familiar with, all you would have to do is name the person who wrote that article, right? Give us the author. For example, if Stephen Hawking wrote something about the universe, right? About astrophysics, you could just say, according to Stephen Hawking in 2016. However, if the author is someone who isn't well known by your audience, for example, Joe Schmo from the New York Times, if you just say, according to Joe Schmo in 2016, your audience isn't going to know who you're talking about. However, if you say, according to the New York Times in 2016, that is a lot more credible for your audience, and they're much more likely to buy the information that you're selling. If you have a special author who's an expert in the field but isn't well known by the audience, you could give us the expert's name and then tell us why we should listen to them, why they are a credible source of information. So if for some reason your audience didn't know who Stephen Hawking was, you could say, according to Stephen Hawking, famed astrophysicist in 2016, that would tell the audience that this information source is really credible and you should definitely listen to it. So at the very least, you're going to be telling us where you got your information from and when you got that information from. You always need a date on every single source that you cite in your speeches. And you should be saying these things in your speech, because unless you tell us where and when you got your information, your audience is going to have no clue where you got your information from, because they don't have access to your reference page. You need to tell them in the text of the speech, when you are telling them the support that you are putting out there, where you got that support. So tell us the name of the author, tell us where you got the information from, and tell us when the information was either published or when you last accessed it. Because some sources aren't going to have a date on them. That's just kind of the nature of things. And so if something doesn't have a date on it, you have to tell us that you last accessed it on February 28th, 2017. So we always need to make sure that we tell the audience where we got our information from and when it was published. After we finish setting up the information that we're about to tell our audience, we have to tell them. We have to execute the support that we are putting in there. So we have to say the thing. This is when we actually read the quotation or the paraphrasal or the summarization or we give the statistic or whatever it is. We say the thing. So we let the audience know where we got the information and then we tell them the information. And then finally, we have to have the analysis step. In other words, you have to let your audience know why this matters. Why did you just spend the last 20 seconds explaining to them this information? What does it matter to your thesis statement? What does it matter to your speech overall? Let us know why you chose to share that information with us. Citing our sources in our speeches is one of the most important things that we can do in speech making. It makes us not only seem more credible, but it also makes our audience more likely to believe the information that we're telling them. So please, please, please always cite your sources orally within your presentation.